from Columbia in high definition. This is WIS News 10 Awareness.
One of the most influential congressmen in the U.S. House, James E. Clyburn, has represented the 6th District of South Carolina for 21 years. President Barack Obama once said Congressman Clyburn is one of a handful of people who, when they speak, the entire Congress listens. Thank you for joining us for Awareness. I'm your host, Megan Norman. Today, we're spotlighting Congressman Clyburn as our first modern-day history maker as we begin our series celebrating Black History Month. Congressman Clyburn, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Now, you have a very decorated career of service. How have your core values, family and faith and public service, really shaped your career?
Well, I think it's been more about my faith. My dad was a fundamentalist minister, and my mom's a pretty activist beautician. And so I think I was pretty grounded in the issues of faith. But my mom's was a disciple of Mary McLeod Bethune. And when I was growing up, she made me learn everything there was to know about Mary McLeod Bethune. And so I guess the activism of my mom's and the just basic conservative values of my dad probably shaped me for public service more than anything else.
And you yourself had to have your own passion for it. I think I read at 12 years old you were youth president, correct, of NAACP?
NAACP's Youth Council. I was elected president of that in May of 1954, which would have been about 2 months before my 13th birthday. So at the age of 12, I did get involved. And it was because back then, all of us were involved. And the so-called age of responsibility, we were taught from the cradle that as Jesus' age of 12 was a defining year for him, we all were to start accepting responsibility by the age of 12. And though we were in a fundamentalist Christian church, we were across the street from St. Jude's Catholic Church. And so I grew up with a combination of Protestant and Catholic upbringing. And the age of 12 was very, very pronounced for the Catholic faith. So I kind of grew up with that. So I assumed that at the age of 12, we all started looking around for something to do.
Do you think now with today's generation there's a lack of instruction when it comes to this age of responsibility?
Well, I don't think there's a lack of instructions. I think the competition for the attention of young people is just much greater. We didn't have the internet. In fact, when I was 12 years old, we did not even have a television. And so our parents did not have to compete with all these external, outside of the household competitions that exist today. And so I do believe that the fundamental values are still there. It is just that there are so many more challenges to that, some of which is very, very tempting, to say the least.
And one could say that activism really was ingrained in you in a very young age, and you look at the time when you grew up, and that might have been a natural course of action. But I think maybe for today's generation, we get so far away from where we've come from. We're just celebrating Martin Luther King's birthday. And what do you think? Do you think that the generation today has forgotten a lot of the struggles that we've overcome and the struggles we still have to overcome today?
Well, I don't know if we've ever, you can't forget anything until you first learn it. And I'm not too sure that the fundamentals have been in place for so many of our young people today. You mentioned Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday. Well, people tend to celebrate that birthday by hanging out wherever and maybe spend a little time listening to the I Have a Dream speech. Well, that's not what King was all about. King was at the core a Baptist preacher And I tell people all the time, I Have a Dream was not his speech that day. The I Have a Dream speech had been given much earlier in his career. But he was asked by Mahalia Jackson to not sit down before telling the audience out there of 250,000 people about the dream. But he'd already talked about this prescription for how we should be conducting ourselves into the future. He had already talked about the fact that America had given the African Americans, or black people, I think he called them Negro at the time, a bounced check. But he refused to believe that the vaults of opportunity in the society were empty. And that's what that speech was about that day. But nobody focused on that. We focused on the poetry. I Have a Dream, that part of the speech that he closed with is very poetic, but it's not the prescription for action that the core speech had for that day. And even earlier in the year, April of 1963, is when he wrote his letter from the Birmingham City Jail. A fantastic, timeless document, which I often say to me is second only to the Bible in its timelessness. So, but I hardly ever run across anybody who's ever read that letter, dated August 16, 1963. It is a fantastic prescription for how we ought to be conducting ourselves and how we ought to respond to the challenges that we face. That's what King was all about to me, not the poetry.
Well, it seems like Dr. King had a profound impact on you. How has he shaped who you are?
Well, a lot like Saul becoming Paul. Of course, with Saul was on the road to Damascus when he had his transformational experience. Mine took place with King. I'll never forget the date, October 16th, 1960, when I first met King. It was on that date. And we, a group of us, met with him about 9:30 one evening for what was supposed to be just an hour meeting. Well, it was 4 a.m. the next morning when we finally left that room on the campus of Morehouse College in Atlanta. And I had my Saul to Paul transformation that night. I have never been the same since I first met Martin Luther King Jr. Mentors.
Now, one of Dr. King's goals, he had very many, as we know, but was working on poverty, the war on poverty, and that is obviously one of your goals right now. Can you talk a little bit about how you're trying to change that?
Well, one of the things we have to do in order to deal with this whole issue of income inequality, which is sort of the 21st century of saying overcoming the challenges of America's poor, that we see getting greater and greater every day, is to accept the fact that when President Johnson launched the war on poverty in 1964 at his State of the Union address in January of that year, he followed that up with a lot of actions. He followed up with Medicare, Medicaid, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which dealt with employment discrimination, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which dealt with voting. All of these things were part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, and the foundation of it was the war on poverty. And just because Ronald Reagan made a declaration when he became president that the war on poverty is over and poverty won, it was an absolute outright falsehood. I was taught at an early age not to use the three-letter word, so I won't. But it's not absolutely not true. And I'll give you a couple of examples. At the time that Lyndon Johnson made his speech, the poverty rate in America was 19%. 9 years later, in 1973, 9 years after he launched the war on poverty, the poverty rate had dropped to 11%. Now, if that's not success, somebody got to tell me what is. At the time we initiated Medicare, the poverty rate among our senior citizens in this country was over 30%. Today, Medicare is still in place. The poverty rate among seniors has dropped to under 10%. And if we had kept the war on poverty programs in place, I think that number would be the same for the people overall. So the war on poverty was absolutely successful. And today, one of the biggest contributors to family bankruptcies and to people being challenged economically, it's been health care. Dr. King told us in 1966, a speech that gets overlooked often. Dr. King said at the time, of all of the injustices, inequalities that exist in our society, the injustices in healthcare are the most shocking and inhumane. He said that in 1966, and it still remains today because we have never, until now, tackled the problem of healthcare in this country. And because making people poor because of healthcare, keeping people dependent because of the cost of healthcare, makes so many people in that 1% rich. We just don't ever deal with it. We have a governor of a state just south of us. I don't mind calling the state Florida. The current governor of that state got elected governor after being charged with the most expensive, over $30 million in fraud for the healthcare company that he was running. And when he was brought before a grand jury, invoked the Fifth Amendment 77 times. And the people of Florida still elected him their governor. That's because no one wants to give serious attention to health care, which I think drives the poverty rate in this country as much as a lack of education does.
Well, why do you think there has been such a fight over the Affordable Care Act?
Simply because the people who run health care in this country are a small group of people who make a lot of money off it. And I find it kind of interesting that people keep saying that you don't want to turn your health care over to insurance companies. My Lord, the insurance companies have been in charge of your health care now since as long as I can remember. And I've been in Congress 20 years. And one of the first complaints I ever got when I was elected to Congress was from a person complaining about getting a cancellation letter of health care. When someone gets sick with a catastrophic illness and get a letter from the insurance company that you're no longer covered because you've used up your lifetime of benefits, or you've used up all the benefits you have for this year. You can't get any coverage anymore until after the first of the year. Those cancellations have been going out to people for as long as we've had insurance companies. And for all of a sudden now, to get a cancellation letter from an insurance company because the law will not allow them to sell you a substandard plan, and that's to be denigrated, well, that's where we have come. And that's, well, you know, it's the power of the media.
Well, what do you think about South Carolina's refusal to expand Medicaid?
I think it's one of the most ridiculous, one of the most inhumane decisions ever made at the state level. And I don't care if it's coming out of the governor's office or by the actions of the legislature. It is inhumane. Though I'm at the point where I'm not shocked at it, as King was back in 1966. The fact of the matter, if you look at the expansion of Medicaid, it will not cost the state one dime, because 100% of the cost of that expansion will come from the federal government. And so it's, well, we don't want that money. It is our money, our taxes. And so if we don't do it in South Carolina, it allows other states to expand their expansion program, their Medicaid programs. Look at the state of Kentucky, same size as ours. the governor in Kentucky took a different approach. And healthcare, the cost of healthcare in that country, in that state, is going down dramatically, simply because they expanded Medicaid. Here, the Medicaid rolls have grown by 15% by the state's own admission, but the whole cost of that growth is on the taxpayers in South Carolina. I think they're one of the most ridiculous things we've ever done.
Let's shift now to education. Obviously a very big topic everywhere across the country, but even here in South Carolina, so many educational disparities. How do we even begin to overcome some of those? Again, Dr. King, one of his visions and his goal in terms of equality.
Well, the first thing we've got to do in South Carolina is to just admit that we have built a dual educational system in this country, in this state. I remember a superintendent of education, an incumbent superintendent of education, losing his reelection over the fact that he admitted publicly that South Carolina was intentionally undereducating people in this state. Now, the fact of the matter is, I recently, during Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday, I spent some time down in Allendale County, that we keep talking about how bad the educational system is in Allendale County. And I would ask people to go back and look at the history. And what you will find that there was a point in time in South Carolina where people went to Allendale in order to go to school because they had such a good educational system. But even back then, there were people who were not allowed, African Americans, for instance, were not allowed school beyond the third or fourth year. 3 or 4 months. My father was not allowed education beyond the 7th grade. That's because we were dealing in a dual system. White kids went through the 11th grade. Black kids through the 7th grade. White kids went to school for 9 months. Black kids for 3 or 4 months. That's what we put into the system. Now, over time, we now have a lawsuit been floating around for almost 20 years.
20 years.
And the lawsuit is simply to say we ought to be treating all of God's children who happen to live in South Carolina the same way. And so we've decided that we do not have to adequately fund education for everybody. Now, why won't we settle that lawsuit? Why won't South Carolina really get serious about educating all of its children? Now, that is what we have to do. That's fundamental. All this other stuff we're talking about, core values and this kind of stuff and that kind of stuff, that's junk. That's poppycock. We got to get serious about funding every school district in an equitable way.
Well, in your 21 years I guess longer than that really, of public service, you have been a champion of many different goals. But at this point in your life, what would you say your legacy is? Or what would you want it to be?
Well, I just recently finished my memoirs. It's going to be published by the University of South Carolina Press. I think they tell me April 22nd is sort of the target date. I call it Blessed Experiences. And I called it that because of all the lessons I learned as a student. I think the most lasting one was during my sophomore year at South Carolina State College. From a classroom one day, I walked out of there with a thought by the professor, William Howell, that no matter who we may think we are, no matter what you may think you are, you can be no more, nor will you ever be any less than what your experiences allow you to be. That, to me, if I am to have a legacy, is that I have done my darndest to make sure that young people children, make sure that my own children have good experiences. If we provide good educational experiences for our children, and that's why I'm so down on South Carolina refusing to provide adequate funding for all school districts, because our children, by and large, are not getting good experiences. And so my legacy, I would hope, my tombstone will have on it that he did his darndest to give young people good experiences.
Congressman Clyburn, thank you so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
Congressman James Clyburn has dedicated his life to public service. From his early start with the NAACP to his ongoing work in the U.S. Congress. We would like to thank Congressman Clyburn for bringing us that in-depth look into his life and his career. Awareness will continue to highlight other African Americans who are making a difference in the community every single day. Also, we want to hear about modern-day history makers in your neighborhood. You can email us at awareness@wistv.com. Also, like us on Facebook. That's where you can join in on the conversation on this and future Awareness episodes. Until next time, I'm Megan Norman. This is Awareness.